Please welcome the wonderful Rinki Sethi, VP and CISO over at Twitter.
Thanks for having me here, Ben.
Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to see you. Lovely for you to join us. We've been talking a lot actually about culture in that last session, about trust and about accountability and about some of the anxieties and the stresses that the security profession as a whole are probably feeling right now, given everything that we've seen over the course of the last 18 months. So perhaps we can start there, if you don't mind. You know, in terms of some of the rising pressure that we have seen, what kind of challenges are the security community as a whole facing right now, given everything we've seen over the last 18 months?
Yeah, I'm feeling it too, and I think the biggest thing is burnout in the security community. I'm seeing it across the board, and I think it expands beyond just security. It expands to kind of everybody. People are finally feeling the impact of the pandemic and just working from home and not having the outlets that we used to have. And security at many times is an uphill battle, and you need the right support structures. And when you don't have that, I think we're feeling a burnout. And I think there's many ways to go and tackle that. But I think that's what generally the industry is feeling at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of, as you say, this idea of burnout is prevalent not just in the security function, but across the board, which means that these ideas, these concepts of well-being and a duty of care have probably never been more high profile than they are right now. So what are the keys to addressing some of those issues as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, I it's interesting because I made a career or a job shift in the middle of COVID, and it was really difficult to join as the CISO at Twitter without having had met anybody. And here you are leading security for a company that was in the center of every conversation going on at the time I joined, before the US election, after the security breach at Twitter. And so when you think about the mindset, and as a CISO, your main role is to go build trust, and you need to build trust not just with your team, but then understand what the different business leaders, what their priorities are. How can you add and ensure that you're creating a culture of velocity by, and making sure that you're enabling the business through security. And it was difficult. I mean, I remember joining, and some of the key things were, some things don't change, but they're a lot harder in this world with Zoom all the time. But you have to build relationships, ensure that there's really good communication top down, there's clear priorities and strategy set, so that the team that's actually going and executing on security, they're all lined up and they feel good about what they're doing. And then really, I think focusing in on the culture of your own actual infosec team, because they're the ones that are going and driving change. And do you have a healthy culture within the organization?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting story, Rinki, especially this idea of joining midway through the pandemic at a challenging time for everybody, not just for those folks in security. And of course, you don't join a white space. You join an existing culture when you join a new organization. So I'm interested to get a sense of what the culture was like when you joined with regards to security, and then what you were looking to achieve in terms of evolving that culture and strengthening it.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the timing that I joined, right? And when you think about all that weight that's put on the shoulders of the security organization, it's taxing. It's so taxing. And people felt burnt out and unappreciated. And I remember one of the big things I was asked to do was, we need to scale this team. We need to grow the team. And kind of change the culture. There was a lack of a leader for a long time in that org. So it was bringing in some leadership, promoting the team, scaling up the team, hiring more folks. And so we've tripled the size or quadrupled the size of the team. We started bringing in more senior leaders, really building in a strong security strategy, and that the priorities are really well understood across the board, so that the team feels good, that there's not just a single point of failure, but there's many folks that can go and execute on a project or a priority and they're not feeling like I've got to work 24/7 because there's nobody else to do the work. And so coming in and really kind of promoting the team, hiring people, which has been really hard. It's a really competitive space at the time, as all of you know. And so I think just working on those aspects, and then shifting like to make security a top priority for the company.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, building up those capabilities within the team is a critical piece of that. But of course, security doesn't just exist within the confines of the security team. It's a wider organizational construct. So, how have you expanded the security culture beyond the boundaries of the cyber team?
Yeah, I think really important thing was we're working on a lot of tactical projects, but how do you think about it? And this is, at every company that I've been at where I've built a security organization, where it's really understanding where the key risk areas are for security for the company. And then working with the different business leaders, because my approach has been if you want to build a really good security culture, you have to get top down championship and you have to win the hearts and minds of people. And so I'm on the forever pursuit of how do you bake this into the DNA of a company. And in order to bake it in, you have to make sure that you're able to influence folks, you're able to bring the right data to the conversations. And so one of the things was to work with every leader to understand what are their biggest challenges. And rarely would they say that, hey, security is my challenge. It would be like, hey, we need to ship faster, or we need to be more innovative, or whatever it was. And really understanding how do we bake security into the priorities that already exist? How do we give them the right framework so that they can make risk-based decisions? And how do we get their championship top down so that we can really accelerate the priorities around security across the company? And as I shared, this was not an easy task because you're doing this remotely with people that have never met you. They're trying to get to know you through Zoom. You're building trust that way, and it takes time. But I think understanding the business priorities as a security leader has been kind of the key, and then baking in what are the security initiatives we could do to help enable the business, and then give folks a framework to which they can start making decisions and bubble up when they're unsure of, hey, should I take this risk or not take this risk? I'm not sure. I think we need some security experts engaged, and that's worked really well.
Yeah, really interesting, Rinki. I'm not sure if you saw it in the last session. We ran some audience polls about how to top priorities, I suppose, heading into 2022. And top of the wish list for next year was actually well, it was headcount. Obviously, was top increased headcount. But the second was more executive support. So, what for you was key in terms of having those conversations with the various leadership across the organization? What were the key things to communicate in order to build that trust, to build those levels of support?
Yeah, some of the fun things I've done, and I've done this at several companies and found success, is make them the messenger. And what I mean by that is, October's coming up, actually, Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And I don't know if it's just me or if I've just joined around that time at each company, but I've leveraged that in a really strategic way. And one of the things I've done is we create these fun videos, and it's not expensive. It doesn't take a bunch of effort, but created videos, funny videos, more serious videos, depending on the culture of the company. And what I've done is ask my executives, like, I'd like you to come and be a part of that video to share the security message across the company. And we then share that at company all hands or whatever it would be. And so, for example, we'd have a security executive that was intentionally doing the wrong things, like plugging in a USB drive that they found on the ground and then plugging it into their laptop, and their laptop gets owned. And so we would do these funny videos, and it's like, hey, and our CISO or our security folks would be a part of that video telling that person, hey, don't do it, don't do it. And so just kind of create a funny video in the culture of the company with the right executives, and then show those videos and say, and then sharing what are the tips and what are the right things to do in those scenarios. And they've been really well received. That executive starts feeling more ownership around security. They start becoming a brand champion for the InfoSec organization. And they're thinking about InfoSec because they've been a part of this kind of scenario. And so I think that's helped a lot. And I use that one specific example to just say that I think the more you can pull in executives to be the person that's the actual messenger for some of these things, the more they're going to get bought in along the way. And I think it just can't come only from the security leader. It's got to be from other leaders. And when you're not getting that championship, I think you have to realize, are you going to be effective? And so what do you have to do to really build that relationship and get that support? And every leader is different, and so this is more of an art than I think it is a science. But figuring out what's important to them, so that then you can go and work with them on driving the key messages. And I think that's where I've seen you get that really strong top down championship. And some companies are better with the top down championship than others, and so it's harder at some places. So I won't say it's easy, but there are some tricks and tips and tools that make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, I love that idea. I love that example. I mean, not least because it sounds fun, right? Which I guess is the point, but also can potentially help with some of those other things that you spoke about, feelings of burnout, anxiety, stress, etc. Can you make it fun for the team as much as anything else? So I'd like to get some thoughts from you on, I guess, how you create the space for those elements when you have so many competing priorities, things to work on. How do you create the space in order to be able to make time for fun things like that that can perhaps change the culture of the organization, that can help lift people's mood and perhaps motivate the internal teams?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I don't have the magic key answer to that, but I've done it. Like I've taken it on in some of the companies that I've been at, where the team was, and even more recently, that as the team was really feeling burnt out, it was like, this might be my win and my opportunity to build relationship with some of these executives. And we literally took like an iPhone and took the videos, and it was campy, and it was okay, and we did it that way. And so I don't think it has to be significant effort. And I think what happened was everybody this was some of these efforts were before COVID, but even I remember when folks would Slack message, or when we ran into them in the hallway, they'd be like, that was such a cool video. And they'd still be laughing about it. We'd run those videos at the beginning of all hands, even outside of the October Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And I think as we started doing some of this, there was this organic kind of momentum we saw in the team, which was folks were like, can we do more of this thing? Can I be in the next video? And folks were kind of volunteering almost. And then it got so much momentum in the company that we were actually able to go and resource a team to go and work on this kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Rinki. So I guess on this theme of motivating the team, getting them excited, alleviating those fears of stress and anxiety, etc. What are the keys to that? What are you seeing work really well at your organization, at Twitter, previous places you've worked? And are there any best practice that you can share on how to motivate teams?
Yeah, I think the biggest, what I've seen as the biggest thing, and I think where some CISOs fail or security leaders fail, is the biggest thing is you have to have a clear security strategy. And I always remember this quote from a previous leader I used to work for, which was, repetition doesn't ruin the prayer. And I think it's a really important point that folks will hear a strategy, they'll hear the priorities, they hear it once, and then they kind of forget about them. I think reiterating that in everybody's mind, in not in just the infosec team, but also outside of the security team in the organization, that folks can repeat that, what your top three priorities are, what the security team's mission is. And why this is so important is when you have a really strong strategy and you have those priorities, it gives people guardrails on what they can say yes and no to in the company. Because as you know, there's a lot of unplanned work that comes to security, because all of a sudden a new product is going to launch, or a new feature that wasn't planned is going to go and be developed. And so new requests come and you can't necessarily ignore it, but giving them the priorities and that framework helps them decide where they're going to spend most of their time. And I think that's the start of building a healthy culture. I think the other thing is just in terms of the motivation and all of that, I think people want to be a part of teams that are diverse, where people care about each other and are kind and are smart and like to really solve difficult problems. And so ensuring that, how are you showing that top down? How are you hiring your leaders such that they're providing that like space for people to come and say like, hey, I'm not in a good place right now. I'm feeling burnt out, or I'm feeling like this, I don't have the right support, so that you can nip these issues in the bud early on. And then, I think where people feel included, and where you have teams that where people really complement each other, it makes it that much better to work there, where folks feel like I've got friends at work. And I think that's the way you build the momentum, and that's the way you motivate folks in the team. And I think that when you start seeing that culture shift happen, it's quite contagious, and other people want to be a part of that.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. Obviously, we started this conversation off talking a little bit about some of the challenges of the last 18 months, one of which, of course, is the fact that everybody's working remotely, distributed workforces, etc. To what extent is this a challenge in terms of developing and reinforcing cultures with everybody working in distributed ways? You said that it was some time before you met the senior leaders, other members of the team, etc. So how do you reinforce culture in a world where remote working is increasingly pervasive?
I think it's really hard. And, I mentioned earlier, you have to realize that people are going through things right now, right? And so everybody needs maybe something that's a little different. I shared out at my prior company, so I remember COVID hit, and the company had to scale back. And we had to make some difficult choices. And the challenge that I had gone to go and tackle around security and scaling the program up, that was kind of had come to a short-term halt. And I was sitting here making extravagant meals for the company and for my family, not for the company, for my family. And I was like, exercising 10 times more. And then I started getting into this downward spiral, almost like an identity crisis on what is my purpose. If I don't have work as a challenge, what do I like? What am I? And the company culture was it wasn't one of these companies where it had a strong culture. It already had challenges, and they were defining the culture. So when COVID hit, they struggled as a company. And I remember I like personally went through my own crises. And then when I went and talked to others, I understood that I wasn't the only one. Others were going through similar things. And went through like a massive, who am I? Like, and it kind of almost took me to a depressed state. And that's when I said, I think I need to go find a new challenge. And work is a huge part of what I love to do, and a huge part of who I am, and making impact in meaningful ways. And that's when I decided to make a shift. I didn't know it was going to be Twitter at the time, but I did decide that it's time for me to go and look for something new. And when you think about where people's headspace is, and I think, people have gone through their highs and lows, that, hey, I love working from home, I don't. And then company cultures have shifted too. And so I think it's really important. The company has to, I said this again, where it's, you have somewhat of a culture that, and Twitter's got an amazing culture. And you have to keep repeating kind of the resources that are available, what it's, again, that repetition doesn't ruin the prayer, keeps reinforcing your all hands are a huge opportunity, how you run that. In really defining the culture, and ensuring that people feel that attachment still. And even in security, I think and in tech in general, I think it's even more key, because you see more folks that are already have the tendency to isolate, and they further isolated. And so how do you bring them back in and keep them engaged? And you have to try different forms of communication, and ensuring that that culture maintains.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, does this require a shift in roles and responsibilities, in mindset? Who owns the culture? Because do you own it as the CISO? You own the security culture, I suppose. But yeah, how do you define where that fits within the wider organization?
Yeah, I think I don't think any one person owns it. I think your policies or resources start kind of defining what kind of company you are, what values you have, and the culture kind of develops on its own, I would say. And there could be many different cultures within an organization. Teams could have their own cultures. I would even argue that I don't own the security culture, right? I'm responsible for kind of setting the tone from the top, I would say, in terms of how I think things should be done. I know when many companies I've been at, and when you're starting off, there's a few architects or engineers, and a lot of time their tendency is to go and say no to everything, or to police things, or force their way in, or use the stick approach more than the carrot approach. And so you start shifting, saying that that's not the way that I think we should run things. And then you start changing, the things start changing, and people start adopting this new way. And it's the people that start pushing for this works or this doesn't work, which starts then defining what kind of culture the company is. And it's really interesting. Cultures can shift as well, or even be undefined, which is, I think, the worst, the worst thing. And so when you don't have that consistency amongst the top to say that, these are the types of values we're going to operate by. So really interesting, and every company's got its own kind of culture. And it's interesting thing to see, but I don't subscribe to that there's just one person that owns the culture.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Rinki. We've talked a little bit about the talent war over the course of the last couple of days in terms of skill shortages within the cyberspace, etc. How do you ensure that your culture becomes a differentiator in terms of either attraction of talent or retention of talent? Ensure that it's not a toxic culture, but one that's really positive, it's full of trust, and actually that people want to work within.
Yeah, I see myself as an ongoing recruiter. You'll see me like be very engaged and involved in LinkedIn, on Twitter, and trying to recruit new talent, and bring them to the team. I think in one way, as much as I want to be around people and be back in an office, I think COVID has actually broke down boundaries and has allowed us to think out of the box in terms of where we hire folks. And I think that's really helped build a really diverse and inclusive team internally. And talent is so hard. It's not just about hiring talent, but then retaining them. There's a lot of things I've done, I think, that are important. It's one, you want to start building a diverse and inclusive team. When you do that, people in your team start championing that externally. And when folks see their peers going and doing that, that is the most powerful message. And all of a sudden you see that there's a draw in. I think retention is a huge piece. When I know, like, initially when I've joined companies, you see that there's churn and change happening, and a lot of time people want to leave. And I think, making sure you're driving the right partnerships, you have the right training for your employees, that they feel that they're being invested in, that you're not being conservative with promotions, and when folks, if you think about things like, hey, if this individual was to go to another company, would they get a more senior role? Then why are we holding back on the promotions for folks in the organization? And why not stretch people a little bit more and give them the next level position, rather than having them go above and beyond the next level before we give it to them and they choose to leave to another company that's going to pay them better and give them a better title. And so we are living in like very competitive times. And I think it's very important that that retention piece and investing in your existing talent to build the culture, as well as, really opening up and seeing that, how can we bring in people with different backgrounds and experiences into the security industry as a whole.
Yeah, you spoke about establishing those mantras, if you like, and having everybody understand what the purpose of the security function is, what the values are. How important is purpose for Twitter as a whole? Because obviously you've got that mission statement of being at the center of conversations globally. It's a cool place to work. It's an aspirational place to work. So how big a role does that play in setting the culture?
I think what Twitter is and who Twitter is a huge piece as to why people are drawn. It's a huge piece as to why I was drawn personally, because of the impact Twitter has, right, in serving the public conversation. And for me, being able to come and drive the mission of protecting that was huge. And I think that in itself, and we're lucky that we're Twitter, that we have that already and folks want to be a part of that. That hasn't been the case always for prior companies, especially as I've worked at startup companies and things like that. And smaller companies, it's much harder to compete with people like Twitter. And that's where I think the leadership team and the culture, and not just the culture, but the people that interview and how those interviews go with the folks, and the sense that they get of the people, the culture of the company, a lot of times is through that only, right? And through what they've read about the company online. And I think the worst thing you can do is when there's folks that go and interview and they leave a really bad taste in that individual's mind, and they feel that that's the culture of the company and that's the way that the company operates, and it's not actually right. So I think you got to really curate your interview team as well, and really think about what is that you're going to portray, because even though folks have read about the culture at Twitter, they're going to get a different feeling as they go through the interview process and talk to folks.
Yeah, thanks, Rinki. I've got one final question for you here, and it's around this idea of critical assets and critical infrastructures. We've been talking a little bit about critical industries and how to safeguard and protect critical industries, and it strikes me that information and conversation and free speech is obviously one of those critical assets. I think that the World Economic Forum called misinformation one of the greatest threats to human society. So how do you safeguard that conversation? How do you guard against misinformation? How does that play into your role as the CISO for Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is not the first company I've worked for where I consider it critical infrastructure. And so even some past security tech companies now, we saw some of the hacks that happened, and how now that's even considered critical infrastructure. But I think, the biggest thing is to have a strong security strategy. And I can't say this enough, that you know communication is key internally, that you have to go and make sure folks know what you're working on, you know what you're protecting, you know where the open risks are, and you're making decisions not just in a whole, but that you understand that, hey, how is this going to affect, whether it's the platform or misinformation, or what the decisions that are being made day to day. I feel a huge weight on my shoulders. I definitely did when I joined the company, and the time that it was very stressful from a security perspective. And I don't even think you can imagine how difficult of a role that is. I sure didn't until I was in it, in terms of the timing of that, as I mentioned, before the election and after the breach. But I feel that, again, that security strategy, folks starting to build that culture within the DNA, helps a lot. And of course, Twitter's definitely making investments in how do we stop the spread of misinformation? How do we build up entities that can help and honor that? And InfoSec is a part of those discussions, but not necessarily the driver of those.
Yeah, great stuff. Rinki, many thanks for sharing your thoughts here today. Much appreciated. It's wonderful to have you here. A pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's great being here. Thank you so much.